deeply honored to introduce Campbell Brown, writer and award-winning journalist, in conversation with Samantha Power, U.S. Ambassador to the UN and member of President Obama's cabinet. Please join me in welcoming them.
We're ready. That's it. We're here. Hi.
I think I'm supposed to be here?
Yeah.
And you're here?
Hi, everybody. So glad to see you all, and especially glad to be here with you.
Delighted.
So I was doing a little research with some help from some folks in your office, I have to confess, but they sent over a great quote, and I'd love to start with this. It was from one of your mentors, UN Ambassador and, of course, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who said, this is the quote, "It used to be that the only way a woman could truly make her foreign policy views felt was by marrying a diplomat and then pouring tea on an offending ambassador's lap."
Still
So please tell us, times have changed, have they?
First of all, great to be here and delighted to see so many people here and engaging at the S.H.E Summit. On that score, Madeleine Albright was the first person I called after my husband when I knew that this job, which is my dream job, was somehow within reach, Senate permitting. And she said the first thing that she did when she got in this job back in 1993 was to convene the women PRs, the women permanent representatives, the women ambassadors. And she created a group which she called the G7. It's the group of 7, because there were 7 women ambassadors out of, at that time, probably, I think, about 185 countries. Not very good,
wow.
Half the population. So I did the same thing, and our numbers now are, we're the G31, the group of 31, which now there are 193 countries, so our percentages are getting a little bit better. So, there are only 28 countries in the world, I think, that have more than 30% of their parliaments, filled with women, and usually where you are in the parliament roughly plays itself out in the business sector and in NGOs and the media and so forth. There's some rough approximation. So in some ways what we see at the UN is a mirror of what we see in the world as a whole. And within the Security Council now, for the first time, we have 5 women ambassadors, which has never happened before. And so both 31 and 5 are the most in history, but we're coming from a place that's not exactly ideal.
But the impact, too, of not having women be a part of the process, engaged in foreign policy, I was just reading that when a peace treaty is negotiated, there's often no mention of women or how it impacts them, because there's no one who has a seat at the table who can weigh in and say, hey, this is important, right?
Yeah, completely. And the positive corollary to the statistics on how rarely women are mentioned in peace treaties, tiny, tiny percentage of mention, involved in negotiating. We have a bunch of, this is not the positive part yet, but we have about 20-something UN peace missions, either political or peacekeeping missions around the world. Only 4 of them are led by women. But that's on the sort of the world that we're in right now. On the positive side, although the data is a little sketchy because it's so rare that women are centrally involved in negotiations, when women are involved, peace deals, peace settlements are found to be more sustainable and more likely to last. And there are a lot of theories of the case as to why that might be, but one theory is that the women are often very plugged into the families and the communities and the root causes, and it isn't about moving chess pieces around or what territory have you taken, but what is causing people, what is the deprivation or what are the resentments that are causing people to go forth, and then what are the tools for reconciliation across ethnic or conflict lines. And so it's in everybody's interest for women to be at the table. It's not just in the interests of righteousness and equality.
Are there remedies, specific remedies that we should have in place, that we should be trying to put in place?
Well, we have women and men alike, again, because it's in everyone's interests, have a responsibility to do more than kind of proclaim our dedication to the principle of integration. We have to, when we, for instance, if a new UN peacekeeping mission is set up, the names that we send over from the United States government needs to include, extremely talented women, and that's happening more and more. And so, if for instance, the Syrian mediator comes and is engaging the Security Council on the heartbreaking disaster in Syria, we've got a lot of business to do with him. We want to hear about humanitarian assistance. We want to hear about chemical weapons. We want to understand political terms over which they're negotiating for a transitional governing body. But part of what we need to be asking is, and are there women involved in these negotiations? And the delegations, that the UN is supporting, and that in the case of the moderate opposition, the United States is supporting, are we pressing for women to be engaged? And that's, takes time to get into the DNA of the government. It's certainly something President Obama has prioritized, but we've got to get it out into the capillaries. So every transaction kind of comes, not just again with the notion that this is the right thing to do, but that this is the smart thing to do if you want to buy yourself lasting peace over time.
As we talk about women in these leadership roles, they have to have the skill set to be able to operate in this role once they get there. And I know this is a passion of yours. We were just talking about it in the green room, which is access to education for women internationally. Just talk a little bit about where we are now.
Well, it depends. I mean, on the region and the country, of course. But one area where we've made huge progress, and this is really important, and everybody should take note of it, is we have virtual equality now in primary education of boys and girls around the world. I mean, even in the poorest communities. That doesn't speak to the quality of education, of course, but it's still noteworthy that, roughly speaking, however poor or good the education is, boys and girls are likely to get at the primary level equally. Total drop-off when it comes to secondary education. So that's the next wave of where all of our efforts need to be dedicated. And we've all been so moved and overwhelmed almost by what's happened in Nigeria in recent weeks, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in this campaign, which has been very impactful in drawing more resources and more attention to the plight of these poor girls. The larger picture, of course, is that 37% of girls in that region where Boko Haram stole the girls out from their school, where they were so determined to learn, those girls were the lucky ones. Those were the ones who somehow whose parents were willing to risk, frankly, a very inhospitable security environment and expend the resources and so forth to get them into school. 37% of girls, not educated at all. And so as we think about Boko Haram and dealing with the threat, and Nigeria certainly intending to deal with it militarily and trying to rescue the girls, we need to do it as part of a comprehensive look at chronic poverty, of course, but also the political commitment that is needed to redress that over time. And it's so hard. Education, as you know better than anybody here, it's a long game. And politicians in no country, I suppose, but certainly in the kinds of countries where you would have a radical drop-off in terms of girls' education, long games, are somebody else's legacy, right? They're looking for often for quick wins and so forth. So it's almost the hardest to get the kinds of longer-term investments. One unusually effective tool so far in other areas, in health and on primary education, but not yet secondary, has been something called the Millennium Development Goals. At the UN, I know now firsthand, there are all kinds of papers and norms and goals, and often they're just pieces of paper. But in the year 2000, the countries of the UN came together and they set a series of targets on health, related to malaria, related to HIV, on education in regard to primary equality, between boys and girls, secondary, land ownership, equality, et cetera, for women and girls. A lot of those goals have proven surprisingly sticky. So in the health sphere, you see ministers, not just ministers of health, but prime ministers sitting next to one another, looking at report cards and kind of comparing notes to see who's doing better on malaria. Like who's bought more bed now? I'm behind on the BedNet purchasing front. And it's like a little bit of a race to the top. We are now negotiating the post-2015 development goals, and we need to get girls' education frontally, not just into the goals and the targets, but make them sticky in the way that some of the health targets have proven up to this point.
It's funny that the measurable benefits matter, because then it sort of holds many of these countries to account when
it's a nudge.
More than just setting the goals.
It's a big nudge, exactly. And again, that's not always the case. We have plenty of norms and rankings, but up to this point, the MDGs have been actionable in a way, the Millennium Development Goals, in a way that I think nobody really expected. The hard thing about negotiating the post-2015 next round of goals, which again are so important, is that the very success of the last ones mean that everybody's trying to park whatever their cause is, and the negotiations are a scrum, the likes of which really the UN has never seen. Because everyone's thinking, oh, well, because of the progress made on malaria, if I want progress on my cause, whether it's energy or climate or waste removal or, again, any dimension of education or conflict or genocide, it's all being parked there. And so, of course, he who fights every war is going to find it very challenging, to fight one well or to fight on many fronts at the same time. So that's one of the challenges that we're in the midst of right now.
Can I just take a slight step backwards, because you mentioned the Nigeria situation, and I know so many of us followed it so closely, and I had sort of debates among my friends about this hashtag campaign. I feel so frustrated that this is the best we can do. Should we be doing more? Can we be doing more? I mean, what is, it's been a gut-wrenching, I think, experience of feeling powerless for a lot of women.
Yeah. Well, first, like I said before, I mean, it really has made a difference. Whether it's via hashtags or via fundraisers or via, just the sense of solidarity that women and men and boys and girls alike feel toward these girls. I mean, I don't know, I haven't been to northern Nigeria to talk to the parents, but they at least feel joined, which is not nothing, right? If we were parents and we felt that we weren't able to get the attention of our authorities, and suddenly the world, kind of said, bring back our girls, I mean, there's something to that. Again, I don't mean to overstate that. They need to actually get their girls back. But I think, again, if this is a wedge into a greater prioritization of the structural issue, if this is a reminder, as Malala was, who spoke here at the Y not that long ago, I guess 8 or 9 months ago, of just the determination that exists in girls who are not often visible to policymakers, but that they, the girls who escaped from under Boko Haram's grip in the early days of this particular crisis, many of them are now back in school in the same area. Like, that's what they did as soon as they got out of the shackles of these horrible terrorists. They went back to school because they are so desperate to unlock what lies before them. So I think that we have, the girls are still in the custody of these monsters. And our hashtag efforts and our diplomacy and our intelligence support and other things hasn't yet changed that. But I think it's incumbent on us to look at this in its thicker form as well. And whether it's sister schools, and this is, I've talked to young people in this country who are so exercised, and say, go online and see, maybe there's some way to create a pen palship, which would open up worlds of a different kind. I mean, at every level, there's something slightly more structural or more about the larger picture, I think, that we can play into. And I think a lot of that is happening, my sense is.
Talk about what maybe has surprised you in this job, whether it's countries that you have worked with that had a different sort of outlook than you maybe expected, where you've seen progress that you didn't expect, or where you'd hoped to make progress and failed to. That so far, at least, what's been surprising?
This is maybe a boring answer, but the formulaic quality of what goes on in the UN all these years into the UN's existence is weird. Like, it's just...
Wait, more on that.
Well, it's just, just the number of countries that are just kind of reading talking points and just the rituals of just being able to note that you have delivered a message or a set of points, rather than achieving, what the points are designed to achieve. I mean, for someone of my temperament,
is it frustrating?
It's not. Yeah, it's not. It's frustrating. It's just. You have to get all that out. You'd like to just not have to do that, so then you could actually have the conversation about how to achieve the thing that you're. But there's a sort of performative. I mean, again, this isn't probably very surprising to people, but it's not the shortest distance between 2 points. Let's put it that way. So that's been. I think there's more of that than I would have thought. In the age of Twitter, in the age of actual human beings talking to one another in relatively straightforward ways in other settings, those rituals, I think fewer of them would certainly be better. And this isn't just about the UN, this happens at NATO, this happens in formal meetings to an extent that, again, is very typical, but I think is inefficient given the scale of the challenges that exist out there. I think the demands, my arrival at the UN has coincided sadly, with an awful lot of geopolitical crises, an awful lot of atrocity crises, whether it's the situation in Ukraine and the illegal attempted annexation of Crimea, which of course, given how closely I work with my Russian colleague, risks spilling over into a lot of the other business that we're doing. Or sadly, one of the things that the Obama administration building on the work of the Bush administration is very proud of is having helped work with South Sudan, to help bring about its independence just by supporting it diplomatically and economically. And now it has descended into an ethnic conflict where some of the actors involved have almost eliminationist, kind of tendencies and, are just motivated by ethnic hate and so forth. Central African Republic, the chemical weapons use in Syria was just a couple weeks after I got into the job. So I'm amazed at how much one is juggling at one time, all of which in a given year you could imagine would consume you. I mean, if all you were thinking about were the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, it's a full-time job to do the diplomacy, to mobilize the resources, et cetera. But you have to walk and chew gum at the same time because there are people in need around the world, and everyone looks to the United States, as they should, and as we are, this is the responsibility that we want and that we embrace, but to lead and to help mobilize and formulate the international response.
Do you talk about the impatience with the process, and do you feel that clock? I guess now it's 2.5 years left on this administration, and there's so much I'm sure that you want to try to accomplish. And is there sort of a clock ticking all the time that?
Again, in the foreign policy domain, that's not something I feel because day to day there's a crisis that needs to be handled, and Republican or Democrat, all of us want to see Eastern Ukraine stabilized. The kinds of investments we make now will be ones that will benefit any future administration. So, maybe it's because you don't have in a way, the luxury of stepping back and seeing this in the historical sweep. There's just enough to think through, how do we prevent that from blowing up today? How do we get peacekeepers, past the visa blockages by such and such a government who don't want them there? How do we make sure women protection advisors are part of peacekeeping missions? So there's enough, and there's, I think, enough DNA in our system beyond, so-called political appointees like me, where I think we're working on things that will have a continuousness, that will extend into the future, because fundamentally, at least as we see it, it's about promoting policies that advance our values and our interests together. So I don't feel like that quite the same way. Maybe that'll sneak in at a later stage.
You talk about countries in crisis, but talk a little bit also about countries where you see progress on women's issues, whether it's on education or their role in government, or sexual violence, which has gotten a lot of attention here in the US recently, but where there has been a commitment to trying to address some of the inequity.
I would say Rwanda is probably the poster child in terms of women's political empowerment. And many of you know this perhaps, but they established a quota system to ensure that 30% of the members of parliament were women. Sounds pretty good. I think we're at like 18% in this country. But Rwanda now, in the lower house of parliament, the quota is 30%. They're at 64%. Like, it's like, whoa. And, you know, Rwanda has a lot of issues, particularly in terms of political and civil rights of people more generally. But on this issue, I mean, they are the talk of the continent. They're the talk of the world. And it is going to be interesting to see how something like that translates a generation from now, and what it means to be a little girl growing up in Rwanda and seeing that as your reality. You know, when you turn on the TV now, a lot of the ministers and so forth are still male, although the foreign minister is an amazing woman. But that's, I think, the best example. And you know, one of the things President Kagame says is, having gone through everything Rwanda went through, 800,000 people killed in the genocide in 1994, 20 years ago, in 100 days. I mean, just talk about ground zero on the back end of something like that. But that he felt that they could kind of start from scratch and build new norms. And our challenge in a lot of places is when the wiring is already so entrenched and you don't start over, how do you change the DNA when it's long, you know, sort of trended in a different direction? Tunisia, I think, is a very interesting example as well, particularly because there's a very live and real debate right now about political Islam and women and how it all goes together, and the Arab Spring and democracy, and whether it can work for fundamental rights. And you know, the social compact that exists in Tunisia, which is of course fragile, but also is inspiring, exists in many ways because women, business leaders, civil society leaders, and members of government and parliament work together across some pretty substantial differences, whether religious or to secular or across the political spectrum, and forge this contract. So that's another example where it's not just that women's rights are part now of the new constitution and centrally part of it, it's that women were involved in bringing about that outcome, which is probably not coincidental.
We have 2.5 minutes left. I can't believe this half hour went by so quickly. So I wanted to ask before we ran out of time, you and I both have young children.
Yes.
My schedule's a little more flexible than yours, so, and I'm dying. So how do you, how do you do it? How are you managing?
Where do I start? Well, I'd say, I guess, a couple things. First, you know, the whole lean-in thing. I'm in the
don't get me started.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm in the fall-down. I'm on the fall-down part of the lean-in spectrum. So that's point one. Hillary Clinton says it's not lean-in, it's lean-on. I'm very much in the lean-on side of the spectrum. I mean, inelegant would be the word. All I tried to bring so I have a boy who just turned 5, Declan, and a little daughter who just on Sunday turned 2, Rian. And with Declan, I just try to bring him into the loop. So there's probably going to be great psychiatric cost to this, but you know, we spend a lot of time looking at maps, so he understands what meeting I'm going to, and if I'm missing this or that, like it's because of this country, so I try to show him where it is. And so he spotted, I have the maps that have the animals on them, and so he's in Zimbabwe, you know, he spotted the elephants loom very prominent in the National Geographic map in Zimbabwe, and he said, I want to go there. I said, well, there's this leader, but he's he's older, you know, he won't be there forever. We'll get to, I promise I'll take you to Zimbabwe at some point, but it may not be for a while. So then on the way to school every day, he's like, is the leader gone yet? Is Mugabe gone? And then he's like, it's rolling off the tongue, like, what about Mugabe? What's happening with Mugabe? what have you done about Mugabe, mommy? Like when I get home, so, and then the Putin thing, and this was because Putin has really introduced new challenges to the work-life balance. Among the other challenges he's introduced that are much more grave, but so I introduced him to Putin, but explaining Putin is actually relatively straightforward, particularly in the Crimea context. It's, when you own, when you have a toy, and I've given you a toy, and it's yours, and then some kid comes, like some big kid comes and takes your toy, well, that's Putin. And so now it's Putin this and Putin that, but the bad thing is when I went to a parent-teacher conference, this is now a few months ago, someone tried to take something that Declan was playing with at the school, and he literally looks at me and goes, "You're just like Putin." And the teachers are like, they're way too young for this, and so there are costs of all kinds to perhaps the approach that I'm taking, but I don't know how else to stay, to bring it all together or to keep it together.
We wish you the best of luck, Ambassador Samantha Powers.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. That was great.